Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, then this video is nothing different to you. But if you're not new around here, then this is a very different video. I did talk about in my video explaining where I had been that I wanted to take a break from true crime. And one of the niches or genres, I guess, I wanted to sort of possibly look into was pop culture, which seems really left of field. But I did sort of study a lot of pop culture when I was at uni, so it's something I've always been interested in, but haven't fully committed to on like YouTube or anything like that. So this video is a big risk for me to put up because maybe nobody's going to watch it, but it's so interesting. So I do hope you will stick around and learn all about today's topic, even if it's maybe not something that you're interested in. Of course, let me know down below your thoughts, and if you enjoyed me sort of doing another heavily researched based video on a different topic, or if you've got any other suggestions or requests, let me know. So where did this video all begin? Well, back in May, I was listening to the Call Her Daddy podcast with Holly Madison. And to be honest with you, I had never listened to Call Her Daddy, but I was very familiar with Holly Madison, which is why I listened to the episode. A few years ago, I had read Holly's books, Down the Rabbit Hole and The Vegas Diaries, and I loved them, by the way. You see, growing up, I was a die-hard fan of the show The Girls Next Door and of the Playboy brand in general, despite the fact that Playboy clearly wasn't marketed towards 16-year-old girls. That was up until about the early 2000s, but we'll talk about that soon. So as I was saying, I was listening to the podcast and then I proceeded to rewatch The Girls Next Door for probably the first time since the show aired here in Australia. And boy oh boy, that was a trip down memory lane. Some of that show, as fun as it was, hasn't aged the best. Following this, I fell down somewhat of a rabbit hole, no pun intended, of researching Playboy, because as you know, I do love to research. And boy, I discovered that Playboy has a long, interesting, and somewhat twisted history. And of course, we cannot discuss Playboy without bringing up the brand's controversial magazine publisher, Hugh Hefner, or Hef as he was often referred to. I always found it somewhat interesting that Hugh Hefner became equally as famous as his own magazine, if not more famous. But I suppose that's because he really embodied everything that the Playboy brand stood for, which I think was a very purposeful business decision on his behalf. Hef really sold us the fantasy, the bunnies, the lifestyle, the mansion, the multiple girlfriends, despite the fact that he was actually married with kids when the magazine first launched. There's your first fun fact of the video. The magazine, by the way, launched back in 1953. And here we are today, heading into 2022, which blows my mind. And during my research, I found myself wondering, is Playboy still relevant today, or is it a product of its time? To answer that, we're going to take a deep dive down the rabbit hole into the history of Playboy, Hugh Hefner, the bunnies, the sex, the fantasy, the drama, the controversies, the girls next door, the mansion, the parties, and so much more. And side note, if I beep out any words, it's because I'm trying not to get demonetized. Thank you for understanding, and let's get straight into it. Hey guys, Editing Sam here. I just want to say before we get into today's video that I know there are a lot of controversies surrounding Hugh Hefner and I guess Playboy in general. But this video isn't about that, but rather the Playboy brand itself and its rise and fall, and of course Hugh Hefner's role in that. I'll be focusing on the facts, nothing else, although I will be touching on some positive and negative aspects of Hugh Hefner's life. Also, apologies for the audio being less than perfect in this video. I'm still figuring out the audio situation in my new apartment, so bear with me for another video or two while I figure it out. Also, this is a two-parter video, And for those that have been asking, yes, I will be returning to true crime soon. I'm just taking a little break. Back to the video. So like every good story, we're going to start at the very beginning. Hugh Marston Hefner was born on April 9, 1926 in the city of Chicago, Illinois, USA, to conservative parents Glenn and Grace Hefner. Glenn was an accountant and Grace a school teacher. Hefner also had a younger brother called Keith. Glenn and Grace were strong Protestants, which is a form of Christianity, and ran a pretty tight ship at home, with Hef describing his upbringing as strict. Growing up, young Hugh was a bit of a dreamer. He was a creative kid, loved to draw, and kind of always had his head in the clouds. Hefner's first magazine publishing venture was actually a horror magazine called Shudder Magazine when he was just 15 years old. Of course, it was just a bit of fun and it lasted 5 issues. But one could say that this magazine venture was somewhat of a foreshadowing into Hef's future career, even featuring a picture of the month, which is not so unlike Playboy's Playmate of the Month. In high school, Hefner experienced his first heartbreak, which turned out to be a somewhat poignant moment in his life. His shattered heart motivated him to somewhat reinvent his image. He attempted to dress cooler, act cooler, and he gave himself the cool new nickname of Hef, which of course stuck for the rest of his life. From 1944 to 46, Hef served in the US Army as a writer for a military newspaper. Also around this time, Hef started dating Mildred Williams, or Millie, and would lose his virginity to her at age 22, which was a really normal age for that time. He then went on to briefly study at the Chicago Art Institute before attending the University of Illinois, where he majored in psychology and minored in creative writing and art. Hef graduated in 1949, but would later go on to do a semester of sociology at graduate school that focused on sex research, perhaps the early beginnings of his future interests. That same year, Hef married his girlfriend, Millie, and the couple went on to have 2 children, Christine, born in 1952, and David, born in 1955. And funnily enough, it was during this time that Hugh Hefner started Playboy, 1953 to be exact. And I don't know about you, but I was quite surprised to learn that Hef was married with children when he began the magazine, and not leading this Playboy lifestyle that he eventually became so famous for. As you can see so far, his beginnings were far from the lifestyle he would go on to lead. He had relatively humble beginnings. So, like many relationships, Hef and Millie's was not all sunshine and roses. Far from it, actually. Just before the couple's wedding, Millie confessed to Hef that she had slept with another man while he was in the army. Hef, who had saved himself for his wife-to-be, and I'm guessing assumed that Millie had done the same, was distraught. Hef would later describe this moment as the most devastating moment of his life. To try and make amends, or maybe even the playing field, Millie told Hef he could sleep with other women if he wanted to. Whether he actually did or not, I couldn't seem to get a solid answer on. But in the end, their marriage did actually last for 10 years. In hindsight, maybe the way his first marriage panned out led Hef to lead the lifestyle that he eventually would. So circling back to Hugh Hefner's early career path, after graduating from college, he worked as a copywriter for men's magazine Esquire, which is still around today, and he also worked at a children's activity magazine as a circulation promotions manager. At this time in his life, from the outside at least, Hef had it all. The wife, the kids, the career, perfect, complete, done and dusted, pay your taxes and die. But on one seemingly average day, during this time period when Hef seemingly had it all, he was taking a stroll up to the Michigan Avenue Bridge to reflect on his life so far. He said as he stood and looked over the bridge, He thought to himself, is this all there is to life? Within a week of this epiphany, Hef had put the wheels in motion to begin Playboy magazine. While working at Esquire, he had noticed that there was this gap in the market. He noticed there was no erotic yet sophisticated men's magazine. He envisioned a magazine with great articles and great nudes, to put it simply. We've all heard the term that sex sells, right? Well, I'm not sure that phrase even really existed. At least it wasn't very common before Playboy, because Hef truly was the first person to openly and freely, without shame, sell sex to the masses. You may also be interested to know that Playboy was not the original name Hef had in mind for his magazine. Stag Party was the original working name, but another publication existed at the time called Stag, who were none too happy about the similar sounding names, and in fact they sent Hef a cease and desist letter. So Hef went back to the drawing board, and thank God, because Stag Party just doesn't have the same ring as Playboy, in my opinion at least. In the end, it would be a friend of Hef's that would suggest the name Playboy, and thus Playboy was born. The name Playboy, by the way, was actually ripped straight from the Playboy Automobile Company, which had gone bankrupt back in 1951. So there you go. The most famous men's magazine was actually named after a car company. To go along with his new magazine, Hef wanted a classy, sexy, playful, yet simple logo. So he came up with a rather unique idea. The bunny. The same bunny that we still see today, in fact. And it has been on the cover of every single issue of Playboy, fun fact, bar one. And that's issue number 1. The Playboy logo kind of became the magazine's own little Easter egg amongst readers. Sometimes it's really well hidden in the cover, and sometimes it's just super obvious. I'll insert some photos of clever little ways that they hid the bunny head on the cover over the years, and I'm not gonna lie, I spent a little too long looking for bunny heads on covers during my research. If you've got nothing better to do, I highly recommend it. Anyway, it was actually graphic designer Art Paul who brought Hef's bunny logo to life, designing the iconic logo in just half an hour. Art, what an appropriate name, would later go on to be the founding art director of Playboy and Playboy's first employee. So why the bunny, you ask? The general consensus that I got was because a bunny is playful, fun, carefree, cute, and a little bow tie on the logo was added to suggest sophistication. I don't exactly get it either, but somehow it works. So now we have an idea, a name, a logo, an art director. Only one little thing stood in between Hugh Hefner and publishing the first issue of Playboy. Money. Bloody money. Hef didn't have any savings at the time, so he set about scraping together roughly $8,000. He mortgaged his home, sold furniture, acquired investors, begged and borrowed from friends and family, and of course he asked his parents. Keeping in mind his parents were very strict and very religious, so selling the idea of Playboy to them was not exactly going to be easy. His father declined him, calling Playboy a bad investment, but his mother, Grace, agreed to lend her son $1,000. Although his mother didn't exactly support the idea of the magazine any more than her husband did, she did support her son, so she gave him the money. So this brings us to issue number 1. It's likely that at least some of you have actually seen the cover and probably not realised that it was the first issue of Playboy. And in fact, there is a fascinating story behind this first cover. It was actually Hollywood icon Marilyn Monroe who was the cover model and Playboy's first Playmate of the Month, which was actually called Sweetheart of the Month back then, but I digress. You see, Marilyn actually never posed for Playboy. and furthermore, never even gave Playboy permission to publish her photos. So how did the magazine manage to obtain the scantily clad images of Marilyn and legally publish them? Well, 4 years earlier, before Marilyn became a famous Hollywood starlet, she was a struggling actress desperate to make a car payment so she could continue to attend auditions in LA. From what I understand, you pretty much need a car to survive LA. So when she was offered $50 to pose for a series of tasteful pin-up style nudes, she agreed, despite the fact that she really wasn't comfortable with the idea at all. In fact, she signed her name as Marilyn Monroe for the photos in an attempt to conceal her identity. These photos were eventually sold to a calendar company in Chicago, and 4 years later, Hugh Hefner found out about them. It was somewhat public knowledge that these controversial photos existed because they had been published in a calendar, but at the time, few people had seen them, and apparently nudes couldn't legally be sent by the US Postal Service at the time either. So without the internet, of course, these images were not widespread. That was until Hugh Hefner purchased the rights to the images for a reported US $500. Hef was apparently really obsessed with Marilyn Monroe, and of course having such a famous actress posing nude for his first ever issue of Playboy was going to be pretty iconic. So the hefty price tag for the images was more than worth it. Well, hefty price at the time, I should say. Keeping in mind that Marilyn was only paid $50 to pose for these photos 4 years earlier. Not only was Marilyn on the cover of the magazine, there was also a nude full-colour photograph of her on the inside as well. After the magazine's release, Marilyn Monroe's film studio told her to publicly deny that the images were real, but she refused, openly admitting that the images were her, taken several years earlier when she was down on her luck. Not only did the magazine actually boost Marilyn's popularity, but of course Marilyn had a big hand in making Playboy popular as well. The first issue went on to sell approximately 54,000 copies, a tremendous effort for a new magazine. Hef's love of Marilyn continued throughout his life, no doubt grateful for her part in making Playboy a success, even if she never agreed to do so. He actually loved Marilyn Monroe so much that in 1992, he purchased the crypt next to hers for $75,000, saying, quote, "Spending eternity next to Marilyn is too sweet to pass up." And that is exactly where Hugh Hefner was laid to rest back in 2017. Despite the fact that Marilyn and Hef will be spending eternity lying next to each other, the pair actually never met in real life. Hef says they spoke on the phone once, but he never got the chance to meet her before her untimely death in 1962. So I want to go through a few more interesting points on issue numero uno. Hef actually put the first issue together all by himself in his apartment. He sat there on his cards table, just him and his typewriter, and pieced together Playboy issue 1. He didn't even bother to put the date on the first issue because he was unsure whether he would actually be able to fund the second issue. So the first issue of Playboy was released in December of '53. Hef was 27 years old at the time, and he sold the magazine for 50 cents. As I said, it sold over 54,000 copies, and of course made him enough money to release issue number 2. The second issue went on to sell even more than the first, making Playboy an official success. 5 years later, the magazine was selling over 1 million copies a month. Now, I hate to skip around in the timeline, but we have a lot to cover in this video, so let's keep it moving. As the world entered the next decade, the swinging 60s, Playboy continued to sell in the millions and only increased as the decade progressed. The 60s was also the beginning of the sexual revolution, and there has always been this debate around Playboy regarding its impact on the sexual revolution, also called the sexual liberation. So did the magazine positively contribute to the revolution, or did it hinder its progress? Or maybe a bit of both? Did Hugh Hefner objectify women or open up the conversation about sex during a time when sex really was a dirty word? This is a topic that honestly could be debated for hours. But this video is already really long, so instead of lingering on the topic, I'm going to throw it over to you guys to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm going to be very interested to hear your opinions. One thing cannot be denied though. Hugh Hefner was incredibly lucky with his timing. He literally started Playboy at the perfect time in history to make it a success. It was also during this decade that Playboy really evolved from a magazine to a brand to a way of life. Let me explain. Let me preface this by saying I'm a bit of a marketing and PR nerd. So, in my opinion, I think Hugh Hefner is a master of marketing. He created a very particular image of what the Playboy lifestyle was and what it represented, and he well and truly lived this lifestyle right up until the end of his life. Although he did go on to get married several more times and have several more children, but we'll get into that later. So why I think he was a master of marketing is because even today, when you think about Playboy, you think about more than a magazine. Maybe you think about the bunnies or the mansion. What Playboy represents has certainly shifted and evolved over the years, but love it or hate it, there is no denying just how strong the Playboy brand is, or at least once was. So before moving on, I want to share a story that I found really interesting and I think is worth sharing in this video. There's the old joke that people read Playboy for the quality articles, but to be fair, they have published a number of noteworthy interviews and articles over the years. One I do want to highlight, however, was a short story published back in August of 1955 titled The Crooked Man by Charles Beaumont. The story was about this sort of alternative dystopian universe where the main character, Jesse, is a heterosexual man living in a world where gay relationships are the norm and straight relationships are criminalized. In the story, Jesse is forced to hide his sexuality or face the consequences. The story was originally submitted to Esquire magazine, the magazine Hef used to work for, but was ultimately rejected, likely because it was a little too controversial for 1955. However, Hef, an open supporter of gay rights, and there wasn't too many of those back in the 50s, made the decision to publish the article in Playboy. A pretty ballsy decision for the time. And let's not forget, this was during a time when you could legally be fired from your job for being gay. Sodomy was illegal in every state in the US, and this was a full 14 years before the Stonewall riots ever happened. Unsurprisingly, Hef did receive backlash for publishing this article, but ever the controversial figure, he simply responded, quote, "If it is wrong to persecute heterosexuals in a homosexual society, then the reverse should be wrong too." Whatever your opinion on Hugh Hefner may be, he did do some things right in his lifetime. Once again, sorry to be skipping around in the timeline, but for the sake of keeping topics in some level of order, I'm going to be bouncing around just a little bit. In 1959, Hef and Millie divorced, and from there he pretty much began living the Playboy lifestyle that I guess he somewhat created. At the time, he even openly admitted to sleeping with pretty much every playmate of the month to grace the magazine. As with Playboy, his timing with the divorce was, well, I don't want to say good, but the 1960s certainly sounded like a good time to be young, single, and not tied down. You know, free love and all of that. Starting the decade off with a bang, in February of 1960, Hef launched the first ever Playboy Club in his hometown of Chicago. So the best way that I can describe these clubs without having been to one myself is by calling them a 21 plus entertainment venue. They served food and beverages, provided quality entertainment, and the clubs were generally considered to be more upscale or classy than your regular bar or nightclub. The main draw to the Playboy clubs was, of course, the girls that worked there, the Playboy bunnies. Some of these bunnies were even trained to be flight attendants and worked on Playboy's Big Bunny jet. The aircraft, by the way, for any av geeks watching, was a DC-9 and painted black with a white Playboy logo on the tail. And they actually needed special permission to paint the aircraft black because, you may notice, there's basically no aircrafts flying that are black. Well, not many. I think Air New Zealand could be a black aircraft. Anyway, they're mostly white, so I kind of found that interesting as a little av geek myself. The plane was, of course, Hugh Hefner's private jet, and kind of iconic in my opinion. They even called the flight attendants jet bunnies, and as a flight attendant myself, I kind of think that this is the coolest thing ever. Anyway, back to the Playboy bunnies. They of course wore the famous costume, which if you are not familiar, is a little fitted bodysuit corset, complete with the bunny ears, a fluffy bunny tail, tights and heels. About 1 year later, they added the tuxedo collar bow tie and cufflinks to the costume to tie in with the Playboy logo. However, being a bunny wasn't all fun and games. The girls that were lucky enough to get chosen for the role got put through an extensive training regimen and were expected to follow a very strict set of rules. They were expected to adhere to a certain grooming standard, such as maintaining a specific weight, doing their hair and makeup in a certain way, and they also were trained on how to walk, stand, and perch, but not sit, because bunnies were not allowed to sit whilst in uniform. They even had to serve food and beverage in a unique way, all learning a maneuver called the bunny dip, which required a bunny to dip backwards to serve the patrons. This was designed to avoid bunnies having to lean forward and risk exposing anything. The bunnies were also forbidden from dating patrons of the club, and the patrons were strictly forbidden from touching the bunnies. You see, despite the fact that it was a Playboy club, Hef made it very clear that this was not a sex club. He wanted his clubs to be viewed as classy and highbrow. The Playboy Club empire continued to expand across America and the world up until the early 1990s, when the last club closed down. However, in 2006, they reopened, coinciding with The Girls Next Door airing on television, a topic we're going to be discussing later on, by the way, as well as discussing the early 2000s and the resurgence of Playboy. Anyway, several more clubs began popping up after this, with the latest one opening in New York in 2018. But it did close down just 1 year later. Today there are a few clubs still open, including one in London, and of course they all still feature the famous bunnies. So in 1963, Hugh Hefner was actually arrested for promoting obscene literature. Upon his arrest, Hef was dressed casually in a pink sweater, white shirt, and dark slacks, an outfit that Hef was apparently not too keen on for his mugshot photograph. So he politely asked his arresting officers if he could quickly change his outfit, and they obliged. He quickly changed into some more formal wear, and as you can see from the mugshot on the screen, he chose a lovely pinstripe suit and tie for the momentous occasion. The case, by the way, did eventually go to trial, but resulted in a hung jury and nothing more really came of it. I just wanted to share that little story with you. I found it kind of amusing. So, before Hugh Hefner starred in The Girls Next Door in the early 2000s, or more like co-starred, he actually had several of his own somewhat successful TV shows early on in his career. In 1959, Hef hosted a talk show called Playboy's Penthouse, a show mainly developed to bring awareness to the Playboy brand and to introduce the world to Hugh Hefner. The show lasted 2 seasons. Then, 10 years later, Hef gave television another crack with the show Playboy After Dark. The premise of this show was to make the viewer feel like they were attending a party / soiree type thing in Hugh Hefner's home, with Hef acting as the host, of course, and through the course of an episode, Hef would introduce the audience to various playmates and celebrities. I did actually watch some of this show on YouTube, and to be honest, it seemed kind of cool. It was groovy and fun and really captured that time period. Definitely worth looking up if you're interested. The show had a number of huge names appear, including Sammy Davis Jr., James Brown, Fleetwood Mac, Grateful Dead, Jerry Lewis, Tina Turner, Marvin Gaye, Cher, and of course Hef's girlfriend at the time, Barbie Benton, was a frequent guest. And another interesting thing to note about Playboy After Dark was that it was one of the first TV shows to mix black and white performers. For comparison's sake, MTV, which aired over 10 years later in 1981, played almost no black artists for the first 2 years on air. Hugh Hefner made a point on his show to promote and support black artists, something not too many people were doing back in 1969. And he was also an outspoken and avid supporter of the civil rights movement, which had been in progress for roughly the last decade and a half. Hef had also interviewed a number of high-profile African Americans in his magazine, including Muhammad Ali, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Miles Davis. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Playboy was a super diverse magazine or even brand, because it really wasn't. But the decisions that Hef was making for that time period were super impactful and significant. Playboy After Dark ran for 2 seasons, ending in 1970. So now we're entering the 1970s. Again, not really sticking to that timeline too well, but anyway, the 1970s stands as the most successful decade for the magazine, despite the fact that its strongest competitor, Penthouse, began selling in the US in 1969. Magazine sales for Playboy would peak in 1975 with a circulation of around 5.6 million on average, but from this point onwards, sales would make a slow and steady decline, which we'll discuss as we go on. So we can't very well make a video about Playboy without talking about one of the most famous icons of the Playboy brand, the mansion, of course. In 1971, Hugh Hefner was still living in Chicago, but looking to buy a property in Los Angeles. At the suggestion of his then-girlfriend, Barbie Benton, Hef went to view a Gothic-style mansion located in the prestigious LA neighborhood of Holmby Hills. He went on to purchase this property for a cool $1.1 million, breaking the record for the most expensive home to ever be sold in Los Angeles, at the time, that is. However, a little fun fact for you is that Hugh Hefner himself never really owned the mansion. It was actually owned by Playboy Enterprises. Hef simply rented the mansion from his own company for a mere $100 a year. Kind of crazy, right? The Playboy Mansion was also known as the Playboy Mansion West, because it was located on the West Coast, but also because it was not actually the first Playboy Mansion. The original Playboy Mansion was located and is still located in Hef's hometown of Chicago. In 1959, Hef purchased a 70-room, yes, 70-room mansion for a measly $400,000. For context, the Playboy Mansion West had about half this number of rooms. And yes, I know $400K back in 1959 wasn't measly by any means, but still, I recently purchased a 1-by-1 apartment myself for roughly that price, give or take, and just know that I am internally crying right now. Inflation really is a So the Chicago Playboy Mansion was everything that you might expect the original mansion to be, and maybe more. It had an indoor pool in the basement, complete with a fireman pole or trapdoor access, depending on your pool party mood. It also had a bowling alley, theatre room, games room, a bar by the pool, both sun and steam rooms, and Hef's famous rotating circular bed that was once quoted as having more controls and gadgets than a Boeing 747. I am both fascinated and disturbed by this statement.
This is a control that literally can take the bed around for a full 360 degrees. And the point of this, of course, is not simply merry-go-roundsville. It's really to turn the room itself into 4 separate living sections so that I can have it facing the hi-fi area, facing the TV over here, or for the work surface, or the fireplace.
In which direction do you like to wake up in the morning?
Well, it happens on my movie.
Today, the original mansion is split up into individual condos that sell for roughly $3.7 million each. Yes, you too can live in the original Playboy Mansion if you have the cash. After Hef purchased the Playboy Mansion West, he pretty much permanently relocated to California and decided to rent out his Chicago mansion. He rented out the massive property to the School of Art Institute, a place that Hef himself had once taken drawing classes, and well, he must have really enjoyed those classes because he rented his mansion out to them for just $10 a year. Insane. The history of the Playboy Mansion or mansions could really be a video in itself. Playboy Mansion West really did become as well known as the magazine and as famous as its publisher. The mansion was a part of selling us that Playboy fantasy, the so-called lifestyle. Dreams were made and broken inside that mansion. Men and women everywhere were dying to know what really went on behind the gates of that Holmby Hills property. Did scantily clad women and bunnies, not the fairy kind, roam around the grounds day and night? Was it just a 24/7 order in there? And of course, we can't forget the famous parties held at the mansion, attended by the rich, famous, and beautiful. There was the Midsummer Night's Dreams party, the 4th of July party, Halloween of course, and Hef's birthday celebrations. Also, a kind of fun fact about the mansion was that it was one of the few homes in Los Angeles to not only have a zoo license, but also have a fireworks permit, which was very handy for those 4th of July parties, and of course New Year's. I get the feeling that at least during the 1970s, the mansion really was everything Hef wanted us to think it was. One big party house. But as the years wore on and Hef eventually got remarried, had kids, and became more of a recluse, the mansion became a little more mellow and a little run down. After all, it wasn't just where Hef lived, he also worked there. So what reason did he ever have to leave the property grounds? We can even see in the TV show The Girls Next Door what a rigmarole it was anytime Hef left the mansion, even bringing his own food to restaurants because he was so used to what the in-house chefs made him at the mansion. And we also see on the show as well just how run down that mansion was becoming. We see in episodes where Holly is asking to do renovations and does some of those renovations, but the place really wasn't being kept up to date by Hef himself. It was kind of gross by the time it approached that early 2000s era. And I'll talk about where the mansion is now at the end of the video. So from what I can tell, Hugh Hefner was making relatively infrequent public appearances during the 80s and 90s and only really re-emerging in the very early 2000s. Again, something I'm going to touch on a bit later in the video, or actually in part 2. I'm pretty sure I forgot to mention at the beginning this will be a 2-part video series just because this video is going to be so bloody long. So you may be curious as to why Hugh Hefner left his hometown of Chicago in the first place. Not to mention leaving that incredible 70-room mansion that he had personalized himself. Yes, LA is the epicenter of the entertainment industry, but was there a more controversial reason? Possibly. A rumour began circulating around the mid-1970s claiming that Hef had pretty much been forced out of Chicago because of the tragic passing of his then assistant and close friend, Bobby Arnstein. This is again one of those stories that could be a video in itself and is a little bit true crimey, so that's kind of a throwback, but I'm going to attempt to break it down into a few short minutes. In 1974, Bobby, along with several others, was arrested for conspiracy to transport cocaine. She was found with a small amount of the drug on her upon her arrest as well. Police drilled Bobby for information whilst she was in custody, although they mostly wanted information about her boss, Hugh Hefner. Bobby, a loyal friend and employee, didn't budge. Now you may be wondering why the police wanted information about Hugh Hefner. Did they think he was somehow involved? Well, yeah, they did. During this time period, the government was apparently convinced that Playboy was just a cover for a multi-million-dollar drug ring run by Hef himself. The government weren't exactly fans of Playboy either, or anything that it or Hef stood for. The only problem was they didn't actually have a shred of evidence to support this theory of theirs, which of course turned out to be not true in the slightest. Whether there were illegal substances in the mansion or Hef's life, we may never know, but regardless, Bobby Arnstein didn't breathe a word. In the end, Bobby was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in jail, 5 years longer than the other people arrested in relation to the crime. The reason for this hefty sentence was because they hoped to break Bobby and get her to confess anything and everything she knew about her boss. Unfortunately, they succeeded, and the long sentence did break her, but not in the way they hoped. In 1975, Bobby Arnstein tragically took her own life. I think I'm going to leave part 1 here. Part 2 will be up in a couple of days where we'll dive into the fall and rise again of Playboy, the 2000s, and of course the girls next door. But in the meantime, thank you for watching and I'll see you very soon. Bye guys.